here from a plan view, as waves are coming in, all of that energy is going to go somewhere. So that energy is going to go down, but then it's also going to get transferred laterally. So that energy, it all has to go somewhere. And oftentimes we see this, and it's causing a lot of problems on Lake Michigan right now. We're seeing lawsuits pop up all over the place where you have people that have natural shorelines that were intact that they want to protect. People put in seawalls, that energy comes along, gets transferred off of that seawall, and then eventually winds up hitting neighbor's property, which then it accelerates or causes erosion on those adjacent neighbors' properties. Next slide. So when we don't have aquatic vegetation, this becomes a bit of a snowball effect, where something starts to happen, vegetation starts to become lost, we start to get scour, the waves get bigger, the wave energy continually gets transferred onto that shoreline, and it becomes very difficult for some of these systems to start to self-heal without some help along the way. Next slide. So this starts to take us into the conversation of what can we do in some of these settings. Because when we do have vegetation, the vegetation, not only the roots will stabilize that bed sediment, but the actual vegetation itself will buffer that wave energy. And we see that in a lot of places, that the vegetation can, when it's established and when it's allowed to remain in those slopes and along the lake bed, it will actually buffer that wave energy so that by the time those waves hit the actual land surface, that energy is dissipated and there's much less of a force on the shoreline itself. Next slide. So what we do here, go to the next slide real quick, is when we start to look at natural shorelines and what can we do from a restoration standpoint, we try to mimic natural systems. So I took this picture off the coast of the Leelanau Peninsula. So this is big, wide open, Lake Michigan facing, high energy. In this case, we had 3 to 5 foot waves coming in off Lake Michigan. We have a natural shoreline at that nice, gentle slope. And what happens is those waves start to break right around where the vegetation starts. And then by the time you get into this area within the shrubs, that vegetation, all those waves have broken, and you're just getting this very gentle sloshing effect, just 10 to 20 feet in after those waves have broken. So taking that gentle slope, the vegetation stabilizing things in place, nature figured this out. Nature didn't historically have hardened seawalls and things like that. These shorelines may change, they're dynamic. Oh, let me go back. They're transient, they don't always stay the same, but historically, as long as we give this buffer along our shorelines, our Great Lakes coastal shorelines can be dynamic and resilient. So this provides us a template for understanding how we can restore shorelines within the Great Lakes. Next slide. So when we talk stabilization, I'd like to kind of use this term, we have a continuum of choices. There are a lot of different things that we can do, from what we might call bioengineering, which is really the softest possible solutions, simply looking at things like planting or maybe minor grading and things like that, all the way to the far side being structural engineering, hardened structures, seawalls, revetments, things like that. And the reality is, because of the built environment and in some cases some of the energy that we have on the Great Lakes, some of these solutions are necessary sometimes because of how we physically have built cities around our shorelines. Some of these things are necessary, as much as it might pain me to say that. That's the reality of the world that we live in sometimes. But there are options in between. And I think that's what we want to try to focus on as much as we can, is maybe we can't always have a totally natural shoreline, but maybe we don't need to do that. Maybe there's something in between this kind of world of biotechnical engineering where we can combine some man-made features with some natural features to create shorelines that are functionally stable and resilient, while at the same time creating all of those ecological benefits and in some case aesthetics that we like to have along our shorelines. Next slide. So we like to use this term bioengineering, And what I realized at some point is that outside of this world, people like to call bioengineering genetic engineering, changing corn, changing DNA, things like that. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here with the term bioengineering is this way that we can combine natural systems and man-made systems in different ways to create shorelines that are creating habitat while are also staying stable. So in a case like this, here we have a state highway. This is actually Lake St. Clair, or the St. Clair River. We have a tiered rock system, native vegetation along the shoreline, a relatively gentle slope along the shoreline. So we have a system that can be buffered and resilient against these high water level fluctuations, protecting the road, but still, if you're a critter, you're able to pass back and forth across that land-water interface. So we're mimicking these natural shorelines, but not necessarily completely and totally recreating them because of the built environment. We have these physical situations that we simply can't totally recreate some of these systems. Next slide. One of the things that we like to say here is we're integrating ecology and engineering. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, is that if we're focused too much on the ecology and not the physical forces, we might miss something. And the reality is we have these hard physical forces interacting with our shorelines. But if we focus too much on the engineering side of things, then we're going to miss out on that habitat side and the ecological side, which is an incredibly important goal associated with these projects as well. So these natural shoreline landscapes, they become a puzzle. So what we've got to be able to do is wear a lot of different hats at once. What that means is that we've got to understand in some way, shape, or form water, soils, plants, landforms, how this energy works, habitat, human use, aesthetics. And then one of the things that I throw in here is you need to be a bit of a social person too, because we've become very accustomed to shoreline landscapes being a certain way. And oftentimes that means mowed grass right down to the water's edge. And in this case, we've really disconnected the land from the water, from a habitat perspective. So you've got to understand not only how to be a little bit of a jack of all trades and how to understand at least a little bit of all of these things and understand how they might affect your shoreline, but you also have to understand how to communicate this message to your neighbors or your local community, and that you're not just letting weeds grow up, you're not just ignoring your shoreline, but you're actually trying to create a system that's ecologically beneficial for fish and frogs and turtles and birds. You're also trying to make your shoreline more beautiful, and at the same time create something where you can still use your shoreline and you're not losing shoreline over time. So it is possible to balance all of these goals, but that's something that we say over and over again with natural shorelines, is it has to be a balance. You have to understand aesthetics, function, and ecology all wrapped into one. Next slide. So something that comes up a lot, especially in recent years, is how do we maintain these shorelines in different ways in the face of these fluctuating water levels? It feels like every year that goes by, we're having to reinvent how we look at these things a little bit. Through that process, we're learning, and through the process, part of the things that we're starting to understand is that we have to be as flexible and adaptable as nature is. Nature doesn't read the books that we write about it. We can't sit here and predict what's going to happen along a shoreline, but what we have to understand is that we have to take a look through our own observations and our own understanding of these shorelines at what's changing, and then adapt our knowledge and our practice accordingly as these shorelines change from year to year. Because the reality is that shorelines are going to change as water levels fluctuate. And what that's going to mean is that how we maintain these shorelines is going to change as water levels fluctuate. So sometimes higher water levels can actually be a good thing from a maintenance perspective. And this is something that might be tough to say in the newspaper right now. But if you use the water level rise that we saw from, say, 2016 to about now as an example, back in 2016 and 2017, there was a large effort to treat Phragmites, which is a common invasive plant species, all the way around Muskegon Lake. because of historic and sustained low water levels around 2013, 2012, 2014, Phragmites had really begun to encroach all the way around the shoreline. And especially the people on the north side of Muskegon Lake probably saw that quite a bit. That big expensive homes had 15 to 20 foot tall Phragmites growing right in front of their properties, which inhibits views, it inhibits your ability to use the shoreline. It has a significant economic and social impact on those properties. Well, at the same time that we started an effort to actually control those Phragmites through the use of herbicide applications, Lake Michigan rose. And what we found is that through 1 year of treatment, the data actually showed that we had a 95% reduction in Phragmites. Now, we can't take credit for all of that from the herbicide applications. The herbicide applications helped, but we got a big assist from those rising water levels, and we saw this all throughout the Great Lakes. That actually reduced the competition of Phragmites. So there's going to be this zone where these plant communities are going to change regularly. Can we go to the next slide? And Grand Trunk is kind of a good example of that. So this is a drone picture of the Grand Trunk shoreline down on the south portion of the lake. A few years back, this zone here was basically filled with cattails and had a lot of cattails out there. Purple loosestrife was starting to get established. Phragmites was starting to get established. As the lake came up, this community shifted. And what happened is we lost a lot of those cattails, we lost a lot of those Phragmites, and a lot of these emergent plants started to come in its place. So it's not that things were lost, it's not that the shoreline was ruined by any means, it's that we had an ecological community shift. And in this case, what we actually found is that this community became more diverse and had less invasive species as these water levels came up. So in this particular case, maintenance of Grand Trunk actually gets a little bit easier because of high water levels. Now that's not always going to be the case, but that's something to keep in mind, is that these things are going to be dynamic and they're going to change and shift regularly. So talking about all of that, we're going to kind of wrap things up with the last few minutes here to lighten things up a little bit and just show you some of the different shoreline plants that you'll see. Last year and last fall, we actually went through and monitored every restored site all the way around Muskegon. And what we found is some commonalities for plant species that we're finding on a lot of these restored sites. So